I've chosen to talk almost exclusively on NIPT because this is possibly the biggest development, certainly in my lifetime, and only secondary to ultrasound in the history of obstetrics, I would say. I actually went to medical school with the chap who should be mentioned in the same breath as NIPT, Dennis Lowe, who's a professor in Hong Kong now, actually how to feel inadequate, because he is the sort of person who now, if he doesn't win the Nobel Prize, there is no justice. So why now? Well, many of you will be aware that 2018 is the year, so the National Screening Committee says they're going to roll out in an evaluated rollout, so it's not a service as yet, they're going to evaluate it closely, NIPT. But it's not going to be for everybody, it's going to be for women who are high chance. Now notice the word chance has replaced risk. Forgive me if I go back into old risk and so on, it's just a habit, but chance is the more correct term. For trisomy 13, 18 and 21. You can also choose to have NIPT if, for example, you have a positive quad test. Note it's only for singletons, not for multiples, come on to that in a minute. Gender will not be reported, and it's a 3-year evaluative program, and who knows what will happen after that. So as an overall picture of what's been going on in the main area, which is the Down syndrome screening, you'll see, and 13 and 18, you'll see that actually this is the birth prevalence, so effectively the number of Down syndrome babies born over 10 years or so, and this is the total prevalence. So actually this is going up, and that simply reflects the fact that women generally are having babies older. So the total number of babies, if you just on the face of it, if that's what you're going to measure, seems to make no difference, but of course it is, because without screening and everything, this would be going up as well. So, have to put this into some kind of context, and if you look at that picture, which you'll all be familiar with, no doubt, because it's in the handheld notes and so on, but it's actually, the bits in green is what we're interested in, which is the fetal anomaly screening, is just part of a huge machine of screening in early pregnancy right through to newborn screening. So it's worthwhile bearing that in mind. So what's the fetal anomaly screening program for? Just that bit in green. Well, it's not just about Down syndrome, as you can see. The other major trisomies I've mentioned, but also there's the disorders we pick up at the 20-week scan and the 10 that you'll be familiar with on the right-hand side. It's very clear, or we need to be very clear, what is the aim of all this? And it hasn't actually changed from what we do already. So in other words, we're not forcing, the NHS are offering to screen and assess the chance of those, and at the same time to facilitate choice. And the overall outcome that the NHS wants is for women to be able to make an informed and be supported in making these important decisions. So this is the pathway. Now don't worry about this. It's actually quite simple for you and I because we're familiar with all this. But it does raise the question what it would be like for the average uninitiated mother who you're about to counsel so carefully. But basically, you can go down the right-hand side, the left-hand side of the screen, and you end up high risk or not if you've had first trimester screening, or down the right-hand side via a quad test. So you end up at the bottom, high chance or low chance. And then you move to the next screen, and the new thing is the bit in the middle, the NIPT, which wasn't there before, because before you had the choice to go further, to have invasive testing. Now you can have non-invasive testing via the tests I'm going to tell you about. And then eventually you rig around here with a positive result. Things haven't changed. There's no onus on you to do anything. You may just choose to have that information, or you may choose to end the pregnancy. So how does NIPT work? Well, we all know our genes are in pairs and they're packaged onto the double helix there, and they're wound up and form the chromosomes on the left-hand side. And you can look at those from every cell. We've got 23 pairs, XY, XX for boys and girls respectively. So what happened with what we're used to is you'd have your nuchal translucency scan combined with bloods nowadays, and then if you chose with the positive result, you'd have an amniocentesis. And literally, you look at these under a microscope and line them all up, and if the defect or the bit missing is big enough, you may pick up a deletion. You'd certainly expect to see an extra chromosome, and that's how it is. So this is how cell-free fetal DNA works. And actually, it highlights the fact that it is a misnomer. It's not fetal DNA, it's actually placental DNA, which you'd like to think is the same thing, but it isn't necessarily so, because we all know that sometimes the placenta has problems that the baby doesn't. Okay, so it is an amazing thing that in pregnancy from about 7 weeks, that a significant proportion of the DNA floating around in the mother's blood is from the fetus or the placenta, as I say, and then 2 hours after delivery, it disappears. And that's the fraction that they're going to be looking at. And of course, if we can manage to do all the testing I've described non-invasively, then one of the really good features is that those 250 babies who are lost as a result of invasive testing can be reduced hugely. Now, this isn't new. We're actually already, many of us will be aware of it being used in a much smaller way. For example, in sex-linked disorders, and an example of that would be Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which only affects boys. And so if you know you've got a girl, then that child is not at risk of this serious problem. And so this test has already been rolled out to test the baby as soon as you possibly can, way before a scan would determine the gender and give the mum the information they require. It's actually been used in a load of other things as well, very successfully. Rhesus I'll talk about a bit now, because that's now a national service, but there are these other conditions now that we can pretty much diagnose just from a maternal blood test. So current application for rhesus negative ones has been around now for, Bristol pioneered this in 2003, and all you do is you take the mum's blood sample and it'll tell you whether your baby, if you're rhesus negative, if your baby is rhesus positive, in which case you can react against it or not. And so the pathway, potentially, if everybody undergoes this, is of the 120,000 rhesus negative approximately women a year, you'll be able to say that only the left-hand side, the 78,000 are the pregnancies at risk, so they don't need any anti-G before or after pregnancy. So this is the title of the thing, and I welcome your input, because this is a crystal ball I've just spent a few weeks thinking about, and you will have thought about this, no doubt. What are the implications of all this? Well, immediately, it has the potential to be regarded as a routine test, just like a hemoglobin. You know, even if you didn't particularly want your blood count measured, it's not necessarily got the massive implications that this test could have. And so therefore, there is a temptation, perhaps, that women may not give it as much thought, and perhaps the counselling, the temptation not to counsel them particularly closely. And there's lots of stalls out there. There may be a temptation for private companies and so on to have tests introduced without proper validation and quality control. So there's a few examples of the private companies, which of course we're very grateful to, because if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be looking at this test at all. But it is interesting to note the media response to when it first came out. So this is prior to this announcement for 2018's rollout. You know, it's all very positive, DNA blood tests, blah, 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 to the ones that are coming out now, which you'll probably be aware of, This was just a week ago in the Mail on Sunday, hinting that this is just a program to eradicate one particular condition. And there's websites, here's one, don'tscreenusout.org. That's, again, worrying about eradication of Down syndrome. And remember, the aim of all of this is not to do that, it's to give women choice. And this is the church. Only 2 days ago in the Sunday Times, the church has come in saying Down's children must not vanish according to the synod. So you can see what a hot topic this is, and you tread very carefully when you're talking about this sensitive issue. So these are the harsh facts. Our current combined screening has a nearly 90% detection rate, false positive about 5%. NIPT has the potential for nearly 100% detection with a very low false positive rate. So the figures sort of speak for themselves. In a nutshell, it's simply a better test. And it has the potential to transform prenatal diagnosis. This graph shows what we will be doing and the likely impact on the detection of Down syndrome. If you look, we're going to be offering, if you've got a higher chance of 1 in 150, so that's the first screen, isn't it? And that will determine the detection rate. It'll still be 85 to 90%, okay? So minimal effect on the detection rate, but it will certainly reduce the risk, the invasive testing rate. And that's what the UK NSC felt it would do. This is a projection, massively reduce the number of invasive tests from 8,000 to 1,500, okay? We've been doing Exeter in a sort of similar way. In other words, if you have a high chance result, instead of just literally saying, well, you can have an amnio, CVS, and so on, we actually say we will facilitate you, we still have to pay for it, to have NIPT. And so even with that semi-private service, you can see that the number of amnios and CVS has dropped down dramatically from 105 in 2013 down to 45. So that I think is already showing its benefit. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages of rolling it out in this contingent way. Lower incidence of invasive procedures and hence lower miscarriage risk. But your lives are going to be made more challenging because it's going to require more counselling. Talking to my screening midwives, they reckon it takes almost an hour to counsel a mother properly. Remember, this isn't just available in the NHS. People are going to come in with low-risk results, and they may conflict with a high-risk combined testing result, and you'll have to try and undo that knot. The other thing that's an unforeseen consequence is you have a high chance result, say you're 12 weeks, and then you go and see the midwife, who then says, what would you like to do? So, well, I'd like to go down NIPT. So that will take 3 or 4 days. And then, sadly, it comes back positive. And then it'll take a couple of days to get to see somebody do a CVS. Do you see where I'm going? The actual result is going to take you to 14, 15 weeks. And that raises a whole lot of issues, whereas actually the test would have worked at 9, 10 weeks, and everything would have been done a lot quicker. There are anxieties for the women who won't be offered this test. Twins aren't going to be offered it, and yet that's the very group who you want to avoid doing invasive testing, because they have a 2% risk of losing not just one, but both. If you're later than 20 weeks in your book, you can't have it. You can't have anything. You can't have a quad test, so that's a shame. And then most of all, this is really harsh, if you've had a baby with or without screening, so if it's missed, or you didn't have screening and so on, you had a baby with Down syndrome, in the next pregnancy you will not be offered NIPT. You'll just have to go through the screening process again, which might have missed it last time. Strikes me as being a bit unkind. So why isn't NIPT being offered to all women? And the simple answer is cost. And that's what the UK NSC said, actually it's going to cost too much money, so the the money better be used elsewhere. And this is what the cost projection was if they offered it to every single woman, about £45 million, a great deal of money. But the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists got into very deep water when they gently pointed out that that cost-effective analysis didn't take into account the costs of looking after babies with trisomy 21. And I don't know whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, but I think it's certainly an issue you should at least just be prepared to discuss, given that if you did roll it out to everybody, 289 more babies would not need all the care and help that they do. So that caused a massive media storm, that RCOG thing. There's that. So I think these ethical things need to be discussed very carefully, and I point you to this Nuffield Council Bioethics report, published as free online. And in essence, it says, we're going to do this, we've got to do it properly, got to give women lots of information so that they can make informed choice. And I don't think anybody can disagree with that. It's a good report, and I recommend, if you're interested in this, looking at it. At the same time, all credit to the NHS for setting up this RAPID, which is looking at the implications, social, ethical, and practical of NIPT. So to conclude, this is going to happen this year. I understand in March, they're going to announce 2 centres where the blood will be analysed. And then between March and October, it will be, hospitals will be invited to send bloods. It's inevitably going to reduce the number of invasive procedures and the number of miscarriages. In the way it's been introduced, in this slightly bizarre, you have to be high chance to get this, it will have, I'm not sure what the impact will be on the number of mothers opting for screening and the number of terminations, I don't know. But it will require a great deal of proper information provision. But after 3 years, I think it's inevitable that women will clamour for this test to be given to all mothers. History tells us that. If you remember the history of screening, we didn't have anything. You just asked the date of birth and you were offered an amnio. Then double testing came in. Where? In the private sector. NHS caught up. Then the triple test. Where? Private sector. NHS caught up. And then nuchal translucency came along. There were hordes of private clinics that people flocked to, and eventually, do you see where it's going? I think this is exactly the same, and I think that's absolutely the right way it should go. Thank you very much.